Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the heated rhetoric around the ongoing non-citizen migrant crisis impacting Illinois and the latest in a challenge against Illinois' gun and magazine ban. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. The U.S. Supreme Court now has another challenge against Illinois' gun ban on its docket. Wednesday, the nation's high court docketed the case out of Naperville, where plaintiffs challenged the city's and state's gun and magazine ban. Plaintiffs are seeking an emergency appeal of the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals three-judge panel ruling for the state. Thursday, Justice Amy Coney Barrett ordered the state to respond by December 6th. Dudley Brown with the National Association for Gun Rights broke the news in a post on X.
That means it's quite possible that the Supreme Court could intervene in that case and demand that they accept Bruin.
The Bruin precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court issued in 2022 requires any restrictions on the Second Amendment to comply with the text of the amendment and for there to be any similar gun control laws from the founding era. The Supreme Court also recently docketed an appeal of the Illinois Supreme Court's ruling on a challenge brought by State Representative Dan Calkins, raising questions of conflict of interest. Illinois Republican legislators are responding to Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's recent remarks that said those wanting to close the border or send non-citizens to sanctuary states are, quote, unclean spirits. Andrew Hensel has more.
Illinois and Chicago have already spent hundreds of millions of dollars to care for over 24,000 non-citizen arrivals. And as taxpayer costs increase, tempers are flaring between the city and state. On Tuesday, Johnson criticized Republicans about how to address issues stemming from the southern U.S. border.
Their whole motivation is to create disruption and chaos because that's what that particular party has been about. Right? This is the same political party that did not want to accept that President Obama was actually an American.
In response, State Rep Adam Niemerg said Johnson has yet to take responsibility for the issues in the city.
I'm flabbergasted, but that's just the typical what you run into, blame game and not able to take accountability for the fact that the city is in terrible financial straits and you have illegal immigration rampant throughout the city of Chicago.
The state recently announced an additional $160 million for migrant care. I'm Andrew Hensel.
Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau Senior Reporter and Editor. How are you doing today, Greg?
Well, it's getting closer to the holiday season after Thanksgiving. I think I'm off my turkey stupor, but man, I'm looking forward to some snow and some gifts and wrapping up this year.
I hear you, Greg. We are recording this on Thursday, November 30th, and we've got some breaking news today. The U.S. Supreme Court is taking up another, or at least is docketing another challenge to Illinois' gun ban. Tell us about the story you just wrote for thecentersquare.com.
Yeah, so we have, of course, several different areas where the challenges against Illinois' gun and magazine ban and registry are in the federal judiciary, from the district courts now all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Thursday had the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett tell the states that they have to respond to a case out of Naperville by December 6th. So the case from Naperville actually predates Illinois' gun and magazine ban. It goes back to the fall of 2022, when Naperville's local gun ban was getting ready to be enacted, and a gun store there, Law Weapons, with Robert Beavis, he sued the city of Naperville. And while that case was playing out, of course, you had the state of Illinois enact a gun and magazine ban and registry. And that was on January 10th. So the Beavis plaintiffs in Naperville, they amended their complaints to not just be focused on Naperville, but also to challenge Illinois' gun and magazine ban. So that case was lumped in with other cases out of the Northern District and the Southern District in the lower courts with different opinions. Of course, we had the lower court in the Southern District issue a preliminary injunction, but a stay was put on that by the appeals court whenever they lumped all these cases together. Well, the appeals court heard that case in late June, all of these cases from the Southern District and the Northern District, including the Naperville case, and they ruled just a handful of weeks ago that the state had a likelihood of succeeding on the merits of the case. So that left Naperville, in that case in particular, with some options. They had already asked the U.S. Supreme Court to intervene with a preliminary injunction to halt the law while the case proceeds. But that was before the Seventh Circuit actually took the case and consolidated it with other cases. And once the Seventh Circuit did that, the U.S. Supreme Court did not accept the Naperville case. But that was over this past summer. But now that the Seventh Circuit 3-judge panel ruled several weeks ago, the state has a likelihood of succeeding on the merits and reversed the lower court in the Southern District's injunction, that let the Naperville plaintiffs seek different avenues. So the plaintiffs there are asking for the full Seventh Circuit panel to review the case. But in the meantime, they also asked for the U.S. Supreme Court to step in and intervene on an emergency basis, saying that they're being irreparably harmed by the law being in place prohibiting the sale and possession of 170 different semi-automatic firearms and magazines, and also the gun ban registry. So they actually asked the Supreme Court for a second time to intervene after the appeals court decision. And while you still have the en banc, the full appeal panel request pending, the U.S. Supreme Court docketed the Naperville case. So that happened yesterday on Wednesday. This morning, we see the docket entry that Justice Amy Coney Barrett issued, saying that she's ordering the state to respond to the Naperville plaintiffs' motion for a preliminary injunction while the case proceeds through the courts to the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately. But with them having to respond by December 6th, that's leaving the window open for some people to think that there could be some kind of emergency motion or emergency order from the U.S. Supreme Court on a preliminary basis to enjoin the law. So that's something that popped on us here this Thursday morning. And interesting to see, because it's not the first case that the U.S. Supreme Court's docketed challenging Illinois' gun and magazine ban. While the case out of Naperville has that now and possibly could be taken up by the U.S. Supreme Court with some kind of emergency action. If you recall, several weeks ago, you had the case that State Representative Dan Calkins brought to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is based off of the Illinois Supreme Court's ruling in August against Calkins' challenge of the gun and magazine ban. To back up a little bit there, you had Calkins' attorneys, before it was even heard by the Illinois Supreme Court, asking that two justices whose campaigns received more than $1 million from named defendants on the law, including Governor J.B. Pritzker, giving $1 million to each of these two Supreme Court justices, Calkins' attorney said those justices should recuse themselves, but they denied that recusal motion, and they still heard the case and ruled against Calkins. So after several weeks, Calkins' attorneys compiled the information to get it in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, really focusing on that conflict of interest challenge. And that's, again, the first Illinois gun ban challenge that the U.S. Supreme Court put on the docket. The state has until December 14th to respond to Calkins' case there. But with the Naperville case now giving an earlier deadline, a deadline that, by the way, is about a week away from today, it tends to show the urgency more on focusing on the Naperville case than the Calkins case. But either way, we've got a couple of big deadlines here coming up in the weeks ahead at the U.S. Supreme Court when it comes to Illinois' gun and magazine ban. Now, Dan, not to confuse you any further, as I said, challenges in courts on this issue, they range from the Supreme Court to the Appeals Court and to the Southern District. And just to kind of give that status update of the Southern District case, you have plaintiffs in the Southern District out of East St. Louis. They're set to have oral arguments on a case challenging the gun ban registry deadline of January 1st. And that case is going to be heard on December 12th. And the judge in that case, Judge Stephen McGlynn, has already said he anticipates providing a ruling on a preliminary injunction to halt the January 1st deadline to register firearms before the Christmas holiday. So we're going to be pretty busy watching this closely because, Dan, as I look at the calendar, we've got 1 month until January 1st when people are required to register firearms, or they could possibly face up to a Class 3 felony for being in possession without registering.
Your title that I tell listeners at the very beginning of the show is long and hard for me to get through to begin with. Should we just add gun ban legal fight reporter to that too? Because I think that's all you're going to be writing about in December, it sounds like.
And honestly, since before the gun ban was enacted, there was a lot going on with Illinois gun law. We haven't even touched on the challenges that are pending against the Illinois firearm owner identification card. And that's something else that happened today, too. An interesting thing when it comes to the FOID card and the Freedom of Information Act. The Illinois Supreme Court ruled Thursday that an individual cannot get their own individual file on Illinois State Police records concerning a FOID revocation or denial through the Freedom of Information Act. They have to go through other channels. Plus, you've got all of the possibility of further gun litigation from laws that might be passed in the future. So we'll be watching this space very closely.
I don't know how you manage to keep track of all of this, Greg. Obviously, it's going to be a busy December with all of these legal fights and responses and court battles going on over the but as you mentioned, there's a January 1st deadline. We're 1 month away from Illinois legal gun owners perhaps becoming criminals because they didn't register their now banned weapons. Yet the court cases, as you just explained to our readers, the dozens of court cases, or however many there are, continue to work their way through the court system. But we do actually, Greg, have more to talk about than this gun ban fight. Although it's not a new topic for us, the migrant crisis continues, particularly in Chicago, with President Biden's border policies essentially opening up the southern border. Since he's been in office, more than 8 million illegal border crossers. Texas Governor Greg Abbott and others have been busing some of these migrants to northern sanctuary state and sanctuary cities, Chicago being one of them. More than where are we at now? More than 24,000 migrants bused to Illinois, Chicago in just the past 15 months or so. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson earlier this week at a news conference had some pretty fiery rhetoric about this. Republicans pushed back on that. Tell us about that.
So yeah, Johnson Tuesday had a news conference where he was with faith leaders and those in the philanthropic space to step up and help in the housing and caring for some of these thousands of migrants, non-citizens that have arrived to Chicago. And having these faith leaders there to discuss how they're going to be doing this in cooperation with the city and the resources they're going to have access to. Johnson ended up taking questions from members of the media. And some of the questions asked about how to address the southern border. and also to react to the ongoing busing of non-citizens from the southern U.S. border to places like Chicago. And I'll just read you a quote that Johnson said. He said, "It's abysmal, and it's an affront for anything and everything that's good about this country, for the extremism in this country to use people as political tools to settle political scores for something that happened 400 years ago." He went on to say that that's particularly frustrating. He says it's the same Republican right-wing extremism that stormed the Capitol. It's the same right-wing extremism that refuses to accept the results of the Civil War. It's raggedy, it's disrespectful. He said it's mean-spirited, it's unclean spirit.
Wow.
So it's some pretty fiery words there from the Democrat mayor. And we got response from Republicans from across the states who really said that Johnson's words are inappropriate and that he needs a history lesson. State Representative Adam Niemerg said to say Republicans don't accept the results of the Civil War. He says, "I believe Abraham Lincoln was a Republican." State Representative Marty McLaughlin said that Brandon Johnson and the governor, he says, quote, "are both obviously not students of history and are hoping for many of their followers to never get off TikTok to discover historical accurate information." And then you have others, including State Representative Brad Halbrook, who said that Johnson's not a serious person and doesn't deserve a response for his, quote, inane babbling. Went on to say that if Johnson was the answer for Chicago, here's the quote, "it must have been an extremely stupid question." So a lot of finger pointing back and forth on all of this. But if you remove yourself out of the rhetoric from Illinois and Chicago and Democrats pointing fingers at Republicans and vice versa, New York's having the same situation here, if not compounded even more with tens of thousands more than what Chicago's been getting. And you have, the governor there, Kathy Hochul in New York, recognizing that the border needs to be closed. You've got the New York mayor also recognizing that something that needs to be done by the Biden administration. And even, a congressman from New York, Nick Langworthy, recently said that all of this is a glimpse of an avoidable humanitarian disaster. He says is brought not by big bad Republicans. That's a quote. He says it's brought by the Biden administration that refuses to enforce immigration laws. Back to Johnson, when he made those fiery comments about 10 minutes later in the Q&A with members of the media in Chicago, he did ultimately come around and say, while the city of Chicago can't control the flow of migrants coming across the southern U.S. border, indicating that, that's up to the president to make that call and to make that act happen. He said that regardless, the humanitarian crisis is still here and resources are needed to continue forward. And it's an expensive endeavor.
Let's set aside the rhetoric for now and focus on the actual crisis and what it means for Illinois taxpayers. Greg, we also wrote at thecentersquare.com this week that the state of Illinois has spent nearly $1 billion on migrant care and services just over the past 15 months. And when lawmakers return to session in January, there might be a need for a supplemental appropriation bill for this fiscal year to appropriate more dollars towards the migrant crisis in the state. Tell us about that.
And this is interesting because we were kind of postulating and speculating what would happen during veto session. And it was possible that there could have been a supplemental appropriation during veto session that ended in early November to expend more money on the crisis that's impacting Illinois from the southern U.S. border. And we didn't hear anything. There were virtually no discussions about that during fall veto session, despite the speculation that there could be. Then, just a few days after veto session wraps up, Governor J.B. Pritzker holds a news conference announcing $160 million of additional funding for wraparound services to help with the migrants issue. And this, of course, was a kind of, again, just a few days after the end of fall veto session when they could have had the debate open in chambers or in committees to really break down these funds. But ultimately, the $160 million in additional taxpayer money, the governor says, is coming from different line items throughout the state's state agencies that handle this type of thing. And something else, too, is interesting is the governor does have authority to shift dollars around within the budget. And part of the budget implementation bill that's starting January 1st, I believe he's given the power to move around up to 8% of a budget to make for funding certain types of priorities. So we'll be watching that closely. But when you tally up all of the spending, of course, the humanitarian humanitarian costs here, you've got people who are in extreme cold, sleeping in tents. That can't be, downplayed. And that's obviously on the top of many people's minds. Everybody who looks at this. But with that also comes the extreme taxpayer costs and the tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. Not just the health care for those over the age of 42 here in the States as non-citizens, but also the housing costs, which is tens of millions of dollars. And the governor even acknowledged this week that indeed lawmakers likely are going to have to come back after the new year and possibly put together a supplemental appropriation for even more spending. So while Republicans predicted this when they were discussing the budget in May of this year, we'll see it obviously come to fruition in the last half of the fiscal year as lawmakers come back at the beginning of new session starting in mid-January.
The stories we've already talked about today, they've been front and center in Illinois news for quite a while now. But voters might have a chance to weigh in here sooner rather than later because there is actually a primary early next year, and the filing season for the filing period for that primary opened Monday of this week. There are going to be some incumbent elected officials who are going to be on the ballot against opponents from their own party.
Yeah, so the week-long filing period wraps up this coming Monday after it opened on Monday. And it was a cold day. I was out there early in the morning as you saw the line wrap around the strip mall where the Illinois State Board of Elections is. An interesting note, it's on the same strip mall that we're just down the next door is Chuck E. Cheese, if you're ever interested in coming to see the digs for Illinois State Board of Elections. But yeah, all of these, various people seeking office, lining up with their stacks of petitions to go turn them in, to be the first to turn them in. And this is, of course, for the March 19th primary. Illinois does not have a caucus. We have primaries, and the taxpayers fund the ballots for the Republicans and the Democrats who are established parties, and March 19th is that date. So put that on your calendar. I guess just one way to kind of look at the idea of individuals facing challenges from their own political party in a party primary. Let's look at Congress, and one big congressional race that got a lot of attention is the Republican primary for the seat that's held by U.S. Representative Mike Bost. He's a Republican. He's vying for his 6th term, but he's got a challenge from former state senator and former Republican gubernatorial candidate Darren Bailey. So they're going to be going head to head. They both were there and filed their petitions Monday morning. But that's not the only race where you've got an incumbent facing a primary from their own party. You've also got up in the Chicago area, Chicago Alderman Ray Lopez is challenging longtime Congressman Chuy Garcia in the Democratic primary for the 4th Congressional District. So that's going to be an interesting race to watch. You've got Sean Casten facing an opponent in the 6th Congressional District Democratic primary. You've got Jan Schakowsky in the 9th Congressional District. We'll find out, of course, as all the dust settles, who could possibly be on the ballot for the March primary come Monday evening when the window closes to file. But even then, Dan, the next process is objections. So people can file objections to try to get these names tossed off the ballot.
So next year is going to be a big election year. We look forward to your and your team's reporting at thecentersquare.com. But we are out of time. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.